All right, so as I mentioned, the Red Scare was in full swing during the 1950s. There was even a House on Un-American Activities Committee. Yeah, that was in the House of Representatives. Can you imagine that they were like scrutinizing people's activities to see whether they were considered quote unquote American enough or not? Yeah, kind of an interesting and scary time if you think about it, really. In a country where we have freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of uh, religion, like which of these activities would have been considered un-American? I don't know. I didn't live then, but sounds kind of un-American to have a House committee on un-American activities. Anyway, at the same time, Britain was losing its empire. Its countries, for example, India, Pakistan, and Burma, they gained their independence from Great Britain in 1947, and Israel followed suit in 1949. Likewise, France lost most of its Asian and African colonies in the 1950s. The Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States sprang up in the 1950s as Stalin purged thousands of his own people. I told you it was about 50. I got to get that number right. I don't want to tell you wrong, so hold on a second. I'm going to look. Right, so I looked at the number, and some people suggest 20 million, but I've heard upwards of 50 million, so it's hard to know the exact number because, of course, Stalin wasn't publishing this fact. And these people died through a combination of famines that were brought about by bad policy that Stalin had because he wanted to wipe out certain populations, also executions and death camps. So let's just know it's millions of people, and most people say it's presumably more than Hitler, although Hitler killed 12 million in a very short amount of time. Stalin did this throughout, it was, the decades that he served as the dictator in the Soviet Union. All right, so the Cold War sprang up during this time period of the 1950s as Stalin expanded his empire and purged millions of his own people, as Hitler had done with his own people before. China also reared its communist head in the Korean War, and later in the 1960s Vietnam War, the Suez Crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Bay of Pigs fiasco. So that was all not necessarily through China, but through communism coming through the Soviet Union controlling like puppet states, of like Cuba, right? And other countries, and then of course China with puppet states like Vietnam, Korea, or maybe they weren't necessarily puppet states, but highly influenced states by communism of those countries and those countries' governments. Liberal writers, actors, directors, and producers were blacklisted in the United States during this time period. They were blacklisted because people suspected them of being communist sympathizers. Can you imagine that? In the country where we have freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of, personal beliefs, people are being blacklisted. They're never being allowed to work again in many industries, especially like the film industry. That was a big scandal there. While congressional hearings, tried anyone who potentially could be connected to anything remotely socialist. Rosie the Riveter returned to the now perfectly domesticated household. In other words, the women who went off to work in the factory during World War II when their husbands went overseas to fight. Those women were basically sent back home, and the husbands regained their jobs and were able to support their families. So the women, most women, not all women, but most women went back home and were the stay-at-home moms. And they engaged in the baby boom. While Father Knew Best. Yeah, that was a television show about that time period. It's called Father Knows Best. So that's a play on words there. The women's no-nonsense boxy-lined, shoulder-padded, androgenic or androgenic businessy dress suits of the 1940s gave way to the full skirt and princess puff-sleeved blouses of the 1950s. So a much more demure, very feminine look for women then. And these evolutions in fashion reflected the shift in women's roles back to the domestic sphere, away from, the factories and the business world of the 1940s where they had to fill in for their husbands who were away. So it's kind of a patriarchal time, you might say, with TV shows like Father Knows Best and Donna Reed show and I Love Lucy, where the man kind of always has the upper hand, seemingly, on the women. Although, I suppose some of the shows there may be a subtle, transgressive current, but not too strongly. Because of course, they wanted viewership, and this is what the viewership was interested in for the most part of the time. As the 1950s reacted against the 1940s, so too did the 1960s react against the conservative domesticism of the 1950s. All right, so you have it all one way. Well, not necessarily all one way. Of course, we're not that homogeneous. The homogeneity of our society isn't as strong as all that. There are always undercurrents of different impulses, but I'm talking about the overall, if you take the average of everything, right? So the 1940s reacts to the 1930s, the 1950s reacts to the 1940s, and then in turn the 1960s reacts to the 1950s, right? The country became entrenched in an anti-communist war in Vietnam. Without enough volunteers, the U.S. military resorted to the universal draft to fill its ranks. The draft prompted mass anti-government, anti-military, and anti-war protests. So, where you did not get that during the 1940s, right, or even in the 1950s with the Korean War, we got it in the 1960s when we were fighting an anti-communist war in Vietnam, which went into the 1970s as well. Civil rights protests also erupted. The enthusiasm for public protest did not confine itself just to the military concerns. Civil rights protests erupted during the time period. You had Martin Luther King Jr., who spearheaded pacifist demonstrations to end segregation and pass new legislation to ensure civil rights for blacks, as well as other prejudiced categories of people. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 ended the separate but equal policies that had long facilitated segregation. The 1960s ended in traumatic violence in Vietnam and assassinations at home of key public figures. President John F. Kennedy, the President of the United States, yes, was assassinated in 1963. And then his brother, Robert Kennedy, who had also served in his administration, and who was then himself running for president in 1968. He was assassinated then. And then Malcolm X was assassinated, and Martin Luther King Jr. as well. So all four of those key public figures were assassinated during the 1960s. So that shows all the turmoil that was going on and surrounding these events. The 1970s did not so much as directly react against the 1960s, but continued the activism down even more avenues. For instance, the struggle for women's equality erupted in women's rights movements, demonstrations, and an attempt to pass an Equal Rights Amendment, which never was successful. It did not get the votes it needed to pass. Faith in government further crumbled during the Watergate break-in. Remember, that was Watergate. You weren't alive then. I actually was. But I was very young, so I didn't remember much about it except for that Nixon resigned as president. It was Nixon and his party's attempt to break into the Democratic National Committee's headquarters in the Watergate Hotel and apartments. And they broke in to steal information that might help them in the re-election of Richard Nixon. So eventually, that all came out, and Richard Nixon resigned. A lot of turmoil during the energy crisis and gas lines in the 1970s incited environmental movements and added to disenchantment with the U.S. government and capitalism. Women's fashion in the 1960s moved from domestic goddess of the 1950s to mod miniskirts and beatnik turtlenecks. The 1970s hippies wore free-flowing floral wear. Asexual pantsuits also became popular, perhaps as a reflection of the move to reduce gender differentiations. The 1980s seemed to be a direct reaction. Again, you're always getting these shifts, right, from decade to decade. And the 1980s was no exception. It seemed to be a direct reaction to the peace-loving, civil rights struggling, anti-government, anti-capitalism 1960s, 1970s. Ronald Reagan took office and emboldened the Republican Party, capitalism itself, conservatism, and the United States stand against the Soviet Union. AIDS was being recognized as a new disease largely affecting gay populations. However, the recognition of the disease did not fully emerge until the end of the 1980s. The beginnings of this quote-unquote gay plague, that's what people called it at the time. I mean, I don't want to use that language unsympathetically, but just to give you an idea of what the impulses of the time were like, that's what people were calling it. However, those such names tended to increase the taboo against homosexuality, or at least encouraged gay phobia. Flower child free-flowing wear and straight-lined pantsuits gave way to the return of women's 1940s reminiscent boxy-lined shoulder-padded power dress suits. That's kind of interesting, as working women became the norm. So as women went back into the workforce again, we saw a shift in the fashion trends at the time to facilitate more work world dress and apparel. So yeah, fashion reflected those impulses and changes. Women attending college also became a given during this time period, or at least for large segments of the society, much more so than in the past ever in America. Equal wages still lagged, however, for women, but women in the workforce and at schools were now the expectation, not the exception to the rule. We've come a long way by this point for women, right? Yeah, it's now the expectation, not the exception anymore. But, of course, so many other decades, and even centuries, it was by far the exception, certainly not the expectation. The 1990s elected a two-term Democrat, Bill Clinton, perhaps in response to the strongly conservative, Republican, highly capitalistic 1980s. The battle for women's rights and gay rights continued on. Several countries around the world were led by female leaders in their highest office during the 1980s and 1990s. Trade relations opened up between the United States and numerous other countries, while internet businesses exploded onto the Wall Street scene. So, many inventions and new technologies came about during the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century that people could barely purchase the latest gadget before the next latest gadget was out on the market. Employment was high, so tax revenue was equally high. And the U.S. government had a surplus rather than a deficit for the first time in a long time. Materialism of the 1980s increased even more so in the 1990s, with grunge elements here and there, resisting crass materialism, but still using cell phones, the internet, iPods, etc.